The American Revolution officially ended on September 3rd, 1783. It's not a date that Americans celebrate or even acknowledge because in the popular view, the United States had become independent by virtue of its own declaration on July 4th, 1776. Still, the Treaty of Paris confirmed it. Naval forces had played a significant role in that remarkable, even astonishing achievement. American privateers had devastated Britain's Atlantic trade, and in the decisive campaign at Yorktown, the French Navy had trapped Cornwallis's British Army and forced it to surrender to General George Washington. With the coming of peace, however, one of Congress's first acts was to get rid of the Navy altogether. It gave the country's only ship of the line, the brand new 74-gun ship America, to France as a gesture of thanks for its support during the war. And soon after, the American Navy virtually ceased to exist. Most Americans were utterly indifferent to this. After all, with the war over, they thought, why do we even need a Navy? The Articles of Confederation, adopted by Congress back in 1777, said nothing at all about a Navy. The only reference to things naval in the Articles was the statement that Congress had the authority to issue letters of marque and to distribute prize money. That's it. A decade later, in 1787, delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia drafted a new governing instrument that did authorize a Navy, quite specifically. But even after the new Constitution was ratified, most Americans were unclear about whether Congress should actually do it. Again, what would be the point? Alexander Hamilton had an answer to that question. Hamilton had been one of the most forceful voices for adopting the new Constitution, and he argued in the Federalist Papers that an American Navy was needed not only to defend trade and provide security against invasion, the usual role of navies, but also to give the United States influence in European affairs. Because Britain and France were closely balanced in military power, he wrote, even a handful of American ships of the line would tip the balance of power one way or the other. And that would enable the United States to influence European disputes in its favor. The problem with that argument was that most Americans did not want to influence European affairs. They wanted nothing to do with Europe at all. This illuminated a fundamental disagreement in the new nation about what a navy was for. Navalists like Hamilton wanted a national navy as a counterweight in great power politics. Those who found that idea utterly wrong-headed, call them anti-navalists, did not necessarily oppose the idea of having a navy, but they believed it should be only for defensive purposes. The kind of navy Hamilton wanted, they argued, was likely to entangle the United States in all sorts of silly European wars. Besides, navies were expensive, which almost certainly meant higher taxes. And given all that, the new U.S. government made no move to establish a navy, and for most of a decade, the United States had no navy at all. What changed that was a threat to American merchant shipping in the Mediterranean. By the 1790s, the once powerful Ottoman Empire was mostly a confederation of Muslim principalities with a loose allegiance to the Sultan in Constantinople. Among these were Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli on the Mediterranean coast of Africa, known as the Barbary Coast. Lacking robust agriculture or industry, they relied on annual payments extorted from the European powers to ensure the safe passage of merchant ships in the Mediterranean. This was a nuisance, but most countries paid it as a form of insurance. The United States did not pay because only a few American merchant ships traded in the Mediterranean. Because the Portuguese Navy patrolled the Straits of Gibraltar, that helped keep the Barbary corsairs confined to the Mediterranean. But in 1793, Britain convinced Portugal to join its coalition against France, and Portugal ended her naval patrol of the Straits. Like pulling a cork from a bottle, a handful of armed vessels from Algiers expanded its depredations into the Atlantic, and almost at once they seized American merchant ships, confiscating the cargo, selling the crews into slavery. Obviously, this was intolerable, but lacking a navy, there seemed to be little the United States could do about it. The crisis forced American leaders to decide whether to pay the tribute or build a navy. Many U.S. congressmen insisted that buying a piece from the Algerines, as they were called then, was the more cost-effective option. Navies were expensive and required annual upkeep. It was simply cheaper to pay off the Barbary Pirates. Also, some anti-navalists suspected that navalists like Hamilton were using the crisis to get a foot in the door for a permanent navy. Navalists countered that building a navy was a one-time expense, whereas the Barbary states could up the ante whenever they felt like it. After much wrangling, Congress authorized the construction of 6 frigates in 1794. It was not a decision to establish a permanent navy. The legislation stipulated that the new ships were solely to protect U.S. commerce from the Algerine corsairs. And to make that explicit, the legislation specified that if for any reason the United States managed to secure a peace with Algiers, the construction of the warships would stop. The design of the new frigates was all but revolutionary. Thanks to naval architect Joshua Humphreys, the vessels Congress authorized in 1794 were bigger, stouter, more heavily armed than ordinary frigates. 3 of them were rated as 44-gun frigates, but they could carry as many as 60 guns. They were, in effect, frigates on steroids. But drawing up the plans was, comparatively speaking, the easy part. Gathering the seasoned oak for the hulls, the tall pines for the masts, all that took time. The various components had to be identified, cut, trimmed, hauled to the building ways, and then assembled. Months passed. Years. And in the meantime, American negotiators were meeting with the Algerines to see if they couldn't work something out. And they did. In 1796, Algiers agreed to stop attacking American ships and release all the hostages they had taken if the Americans gave them $650,000 and a brand new 36-gun frigate. That was pretty serious money in 1796. Adjusted for inflation, it's almost $21 million in today's dollars. The United States also agreed to pay $21,600 a year in tribute money. In other words, it agreed to pay the blackmail. Surprising, right? Not where you thought this was going. So peace was secured. While it was a distasteful peace to many, it was peace, and according to the original legislation, work on the 6 frigates was now supposed to stop. On the other hand, so much money and effort had already been spent that it seemed wasteful just to walk away. So Congress compromised. The deal struck was that the United States would finish 3 of the 6 frigates, and the President would have the authority to complete the other 3 later if another crisis emerged. And inevitably, it did. This time, the crisis had nothing to do with the Barbary states. Instead, it was a problem with France. According to the treaty that France and the United States had signed back in 1778, each nation had pledged to come to the aid of the other in case of war with a third power, specifically Britain. In 1778, France had immediately declared war on Britain and had helped secure American independence. Consequently, when France again went to war with Britain 15 years later, it naturally expected the United States to reciprocate by declaring war as well. George Washington, who was now president, decided it was not necessary. The original treaty, he declared, had been signed with the French monarchy. After the French Revolution overthrew that regime in 1789, all deals were off. The United States would remain neutral. That perplexed and angered the French. What sense did it make that the Americans would have been willing to fight for a French king, but would not support a republic? They saw Washington's explanation as simply an excuse to avoid living up to the deal, which was probably correct. Almost as bad, instead of fighting the British, the United States signed a new treaty with Britain in 1795. It was called Jay's Treaty, named for the American Secretary of State at the time, John Jay, and it gave Britain favorable trading status in the United States. The French were furious, so furious, in fact, that their privateers began capturing American merchant ships that traded with British colonies in the Caribbean. John Adams became president in 1797, and hoping that something could be worked out with the French, he sent a trio of diplomats to Paris to negotiate. When his envoys arrived, however, representatives of the French foreign minister told them they would have to pay a stipend, essentially a bribe, for an audience. In letters home, the American negotiators identified the three French ministers only as X, Y, and Z, giving this incident its historical moniker as the XYZ affair. A contemporary cartoon shows a dagger-wielding France defending African pirates and demanding money, monsieur, money. In fact, it was not unusual in European politics to offer a financial sweetener before opening negotiations. But the Americans didn't have a budget for bribes, so they wrote back to ask Adams what they should do. When Congress learned that its ambassadors had been asked for a bribe, many congressmen affected outrage. They refused to approve any funds for payments and instead authorized the completion of the 3 unfinished frigates in order to suppress the French privateers. A popular phrase of the day was, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute." Of course, that was more than a little disingenuous, since they had already agreed to pay millions, in modern dollars at least, in tribute to Algiers. Congress did not declare war on France. Instead, in an action that has a modern ring, it simply authorized the use of force, in this case, naval force, sending the 6 frigates to the Caribbean to chastise the French. So it was not a real war. It was, as history has labeled it, a quasi-war, fought in 1798 and 1799. It was the first overseas deployment of U.S. Navy warships in history. In addition to the original 6 frigates, other ships were sent to the Caribbean. They were either purchased by the government from private citizens or, in a few cases, subscribed by the public. Some cities conducted public fund drives so that citizens could contribute to the construction of a new warship. The largest of them was the frigate Philadelphia, subscribed by the citizens of her namesake city, built there, and then given to the national government. No U.S. Navy ship had a more spectacular war against France than the USS Constellation, commanded by Captain Thomas Truxtun. The Constellation was a beautiful ship, and fast, too. She was nicknamed the Yankee Racehorse. Like all of the Humphreys designed frigates, she also carried more guns than her official rating. Rated as a 38-gun frigate, she actually carried as many as 50. And in place of the 12 or 18-pounder cannon carried by most frigates, she carried 24-pounders on her main gun deck, plus short-barreled 32-pound carronades on her weather deck. That added up to a broadside throw weight of more than 500 pounds, significantly more than a conventional frigate. In February of 1799, Captain Truxtun and the Constellation encountered the French frigate Insurgente near the island of Nevis in the Leeward Islands of the West Indies. The French captain, uncertain of the relationship between France and the United States, first sought to avoid the Constellation. But when the American ship sailed up to him, he hailed her. Truxtun answered with a double-shotted broadside that staggered the French frigate. Then Truxtun cut across her bow and raked her, that is, he fired his broadside guns, down the length of the French warship without the Frenchman being able to reply. In barely over an hour, the Insurgente was a floating wreck with nearly 100 dead and wounded on her deck. In contrast, the Constellation suffered only 2 dead and 2 wounded. It was the first victory by a U.S. Navy ship over a foreign foe. An American prize crew boarded the Insurgente and sailed her into a British port. The United States and Britain were not formal allies, but they were fighting a common enemy, and the British found it useful to cooperate with the Americans, going so far as to share their signal book. In February of 1800, Truxtun did it again. This time his foe was a larger French frigate named the Vengeance, which had as many guns as the Constellation. Moreover, Truxtun had replaced some of his 24-pounders with 18-pounders, so the 2 ships were evenly matched. The battle began at dusk and lasted almost till midnight. After nearly 5 hours, both ships were badly battered. The French captain tried several times to strike his flag in token of surrender, but in the darkness and confusion, Truxtun didn't see it. As both ships made frantic repairs, the Vengeance slowly drifted away. Sometime later, she limped into the Dutch port of Curaçao, where her captain reported that he had fought an American ship of the line. These successes fueled public enthusiasm in the United States for the Navy. One consequence was congressional passage of a bill to create a Department of the Navy that could coordinate the naval fleet that had now grown to more than 20 ships. President Adams appointed Maryland businessman Benjamin Stoddard as the first Secretary of the Navy. That administrative infrastructure created a center of advocacy for the Navy's continuation and expansion, and it did expand. During the war, Stoddard petitioned Congress to approve the construction of 12 ships of the line and as many new frigates. Doing so would take several years, so it was obvious that Stoddard's request was not to enlarge the Navy for the ongoing Quasi-War, but as a standing naval force for the post-war years. Stoddard didn't get everything he wanted, but Congress did approve the building of 6 new ships of the line and 6 sloops. The navalist idea that there should be a permanent standing U.S. Navy that included some ships of the line had triumphed for now. The Quasi-War ended in 1801. That same year, Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States. Jefferson was an anti-navalist. He did not want to get rid of the Navy, but he believed that an American Navy should be used mainly to defend the coast and to protect trade. He certainly did not want to get wrapped up in European power politics. Navalists in Congress, though, did not trust Jefferson. They feared that he would severely reduce, maybe even eliminate the Navy altogether. And to preempt that, they backed a Peace Establishment Act, passed the day before Jefferson took office. The act reduced the Navy to 13 frigates, but it also stipulated that 6 of the 13 were to remain on active duty even during peacetime, while the others remained in ordinary, what a later generation would call mothballs, so that they could be called up into active service in case of an emergency. As it turned out, Jefferson was perfectly happy to keep 6 frigates on active service, and he decided to employ them right away. He divided them into 2 squadrons of 3 frigates each, plus a sloop, and sent 1 squadron off to keep an eye on the Barbary States while keeping the other at home. His plan was to rotate the squadrons every few months so they would constitute a standing deterrent. That first squadron was commanded by Captain Richard Dale, bearing the courtesy title Commodore, who arrived in the Mediterranean in July of 1801. When he arrived, he learned that the Bashaw of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli, had declared war on the United States. The United States had paid Karamanli $56,000 to secure a treaty, but when Karamanli found out that the ruler of Algiers was getting 10 times as much, he decided he wanted a bigger payday. Karamanli might have had second thoughts about this after the first engagement of the war on August 1st, 1801. On that date, a 14-gun Tripolitan corsair called the Tripoli attacked the 14-gun American sloop of war Enterprise, one of many U.S. warships to bear that historic name. The crew of the Tripoli was accustomed to overwhelming unarmed merchant ships and found themselves overmatched against the Enterprise. They attempted to flee, but Lieutenant Andrew Sterrett, captain of the Enterprise, pursued her. The Tripolitans surrendered, lowering their flag. But when Sterrett sought to take possession, the Tripolitans opened fire again. 3 times they pretended to surrender, only to open fire when the 2 ships got close. Finally, Sterrett stood off and fired broadsides into the Tripoli until she was sinking. Astonishingly, in all that time, there were no American casualties. Despite this early victory, the American squadron commander, Commodore Dale, had little luck in prosecuting the war. He believed that he lacked sufficient force to attack the city of Tripoli, so he established a blockade, though he maintained it only intermittently. After a year without any perceptible progress, he was recalled and replaced by Richard Valentine Morris. If Dale had been disappointing, Morris was disastrous. He and his ship spent a lot of time anchored at either Gibraltar or Malta, hobnobbing with the British. Morris even tried to open peace negotiations on his own authority. When he returned to the United States after a year, Jefferson stripped him of his commission. In 1803, Commodore Edward Preble assumed command. And something of Preble's disposition can be discerned from his first night in the Mediterranean aboard his flagship, the USS Constitution, one of the original 6 frigates. When an unknown ship emerged out of the evening darkness, Preble called for it to identify itself, which was standard practice. An English voice responded, "This is His Britannic Majesty's ship Donegal, 84 guns, Sir Richard Strachan commanding." That was followed by a terse demand to send a boat, thus asserting the right to issue orders. Preble leapt into the rigging with a speaking trumpet and shouted back, "This is the United States frigate Constitution, 44 guns, Commodore Edward Preble commanding, who will be damned before he sends a boat." Then in the same loud voice he called out, "Blow your matches, boys." What you need to know to appreciate this is that blowing on a slow match was what a gun crew did just seconds before firing a broadside. To all appearances, Preble was about to take on a British first-rate ship of the line rather than concede a point of naval etiquette. Well, it didn't come to that. The British ship was actually a 32-gun frigate, not an 84-gun ship of the line, and hearing Preble's threat, her captain immediately apologized and sent a boat over to repeat the apology. The impact of that moment was profound. Can you imagine the crew members on the Constitution looking at one another wide-eyed when Preble told them to blow their matches? Here was a commander not to be trifled with. Upon arriving at Tripoli, Preble was far more conscientious than either of his predecessors. He maintained a close blockade of the city and initiated several raids into the harbor. Several of those raids were led by quite junior officers, young lieutenants, even midshipmen. Proudly, they referred to themselves as Preble's boys. The most daring of the attacks was conducted by a young lieutenant named Stephen Decatur. He came from a Navy family. His father, Stephen Sr., had served in the Revolutionary War and in the Quasi-War. The son was eager to carry on the family tradition, and his opportunity came almost at once. Captain William Bainbridge, commanding the frigate Philadelphia, had been pursuing a Tripolitan vessel prior to Preble's arrival when he ran his ship aground on an uncharted shoal. A swarm of Tripolitan gunboats surrounded him, and he was forced to surrender. A high tide subsequently refloated the Philadelphia, and the Tripolitans took her into Tripoli harbor. That is where she was when Preble arrived. The loss of the Philadelphia deprived Preble of one of his largest warships, and it gave Caramanli more American hostages, including Bainbridge himself. The presence of the Philadelphia in Tripoli harbor was a constant taunt to the American ships offshore, and Decatur volunteered to take a small boat into the harbor and burn her. On the night of February 16, 1804, Decatur and a volunteer crew boarded a small Tripolitan ketch called the Mastico, which the Americans had captured, and renamed the Intrepid. Hoping that the Tripolitans would recognize the vessel as one of their own, Decatur sailed boldly into the harbor. A native Arabic speaker on board called out that the ship had lost its anchor in a storm and requested permission to tie up alongside the Philadelphia. By the time the Tripolitans recognized that this was a ruse, Decatur had brought the Intrepid alongside, and he and his men swarmed up her side. They suppressed the guards, planted and ignited incendiaries, and made good their escape. The Philadelphia burned to the waterline. For that daring feat, Decatur was promoted from lieutenant to captain at the age of only 25. He was and remains still the youngest man ever to reach captain's rank in the U.S. Navy. Bold as Decatur's move was, it did not bring the war any closer to an end. To do that, Preble not only tightened the blockade, he opened a second front. Yusuf Karamanli had an older brother, Hamid, who could reasonably claim to be the rightful ruler of Tripoli. Preble, in cooperation with American diplomat William Eaton, encouraged and supported Hamid's claim. Bolstered by 8 U.S. Marines from the brig Argus, Hamid led a ragtag army overland toward Tripoli, fighting and winning a small skirmish at Derna, while Preble maintained the offshore blockade. This march is the origin of the second line in the Marine Corps hymn that refers to the shores of Tripoli. Karamanli had remained defiant throughout the American naval blockade, but this threat to his throne convinced him to ask for a deal. On June 4th, 1805, he signed a peace agreement. The American success was not unconditional victory. Karamanli agreed to stop attacking American ships, for now, and to release all of his American prisoners, including Bainbridge. In exchange, the Americans agreed to abandon Hamid and to pay Yusuf $60,000, which was about what the United States had been paying him before the war. That ended the First Barbary War, though, as events would show, the threat from the Barbary states was not over. And an even more complex problem remained unresolved. That was how the United States could maneuver safely through the rocks and shoals of the ongoing Anglo-French War in Europe.